Good morning, everyone. We will begin the webinar momentarily. We're giving everyone a few extra moments to log on. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this morning. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. Hello, everyone, and good morning. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Gene Suchia, and I'm a public policy officer at the Colorado Health Foundation. This morning's presentation is Understanding Colorado's Local Governments, the Fiscal Outlook for Cities, Towns, and Counties during COVID-19 and its impact on communities. For those of you not familiar with the Colorado Health Foundation, we work to bring health in reach for all Coloradans by engaging closely with communities across the state through grant-making investments, policy advocacy, learning, and capacity building. A few reminders before we get started, as we have over 200 people expected to join us this morning. This webinar is being recorded. The recording, the presentation slides, and other important resources will be sent out in an email later this afternoon. These resources will also be added to our website. We'll also have a few question and answer opportunities as well. To minimize background noise on this webinar, all participants have their audio muted, but you can type your questions into the chat box at any time during the presentation. And if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please type them into the chat. We have a team monitoring the chat box and we'll do our very best to address them. So let's get started with today's topic. About a month ago, my colleague Sarah Manji hosted a similar webinar about the state budget, which is a topic many of us know well, even during economic boom and bust. But at the local level, it's a very different picture. Different decision-making processes, different public services, different actors and policymakers, and yet still the same crisis. Today's presentation should fill an information gap about the local level fiscal situation, but also about the local policy landscape, especially for those advocates and grantees who have limited engagement with local governments and the critical services they provide. Our own engagement at the local government level is a new body of work for us, and we know it's an emerging area for advocacy with many of our nonprofit partners. Our briefing this morning is one of our first that examines local policy and advocacy in Colorado, but it certainly won't be our last. We know that the universe of local governments is large and vast, inclusive of cities, towns, counties, school districts, special districts, and many others. Over time, we hope to bring detailed content to you about what's happening locally, especially in the pursuit of health equity. However, today's focus will be on cities, towns, and counties in our state and their response to the crisis. In just a moment, you'll see a pop-up appear on screen to participate in a couple polling questions we have this morning. You'll have just under a minute to complete this. Our experts have a lot to share with you this morning, but we want to get a better sense of our audience and what you bring to the table. Let us know where in Colorado you are and what your level of engagement with local government has been. During the course of our presentation today, we will try our best to share local and regional examples from across the Centennial State, even if we can't get too detailed about all of them. I will allow just a few more seconds here on this, and as I end the poll and share the results, take a look. And a quick reminder that we'll be taking audience questions throughout this event. So again, please use the chat box to send in your questions. Now, let me introduce our first speaker. Roger Sherman joined CRL Associates in 2005 and assists clients in both the public and private sectors craft and implement integrated strategies that connect them with top decision makers, shape public opinion, and transform public policy. Roger has been a strategic consultant to several transportation-related initiatives around the country, including Denver's Fast Tracks Yes campaign. He is chair of the board of directors of Safe House Denver, which serves victims of domestic violence and their children. Roger, good morning. What can you tell us about the state of local governments right now?
Well, thank you, Gene, and thanks for having me here. I'm trying to share my screen. My part of the webinar today, we're going to go over a little bit of kind of local government 101 and set the stage for what we're talking about, and then we will go into a deeper dive with my colleagues. So just some basics here in Colorado. There are four main types of governments: cities, counties, special districts, and school districts. 64 counties in Colorado, including 2 city and county governments. That's Broomfield and Denver. 271 incorporated jurisdictions, municipalities, 196 towns, 73 cities. Those are based, your classification of a town and a city is based on the size of the population. And then there's over 3,800 special districts in the state. And that could be everything from school districts, fire, library, even tunnel districts, ditch districts, housing authorities, you name it, we have them here in Colorado. So some of the differences: counties are political subdivisions of the state. They are created by statute and by the legislature, and the boundaries are drawn by the legislature. Generally, counties are responsible for law enforcement, social services on behalf of the state, construction, maintenance of roads, bridges, and other infrastructure, general control of land use in unincorporated areas. And their powers are limited to what is given to them by the legislature and the Constitution. So it's a little more limited. Municipalities are not constructs of the state Constitution, and therefore are granted much broader powers and responsibilities to address the needs of their citizens. And that can be included in administrative type powers, police, financial. They adopt ordinances to preserve and protect the safety, health, and welfare of the community. And they have the power to enforce those laws that they adopt. And then special districts are created to basically divide the costs of specific services between the residents of those districts. So in an example of a library district, that cost to run the library district is spread across all the citizens within the boundaries of that library district. Voters decide when a district should be formed and who serves on the board, and then also vote whether how to fund and levy appropriate taxes to fund those services. So local government's revenue comes primarily from property sales and other taxes, and then charges and fees and transfers from federal and state governments. Property tax is usually the main source for county revenues. Sales tax revenues make up a smaller portion of the revenue pie for counties than for most cities and towns. Municipal revenues, on the flip side, come primarily from sales and use taxes, and then they have other taxes that they often levy: occupational privilege taxes, lodgers taxes, and as well as revenues that are charged for services that they provide. And then special districts generally receive revenue from property taxes. There are really kind of two kinds of budgets that most local governments maintain: an operating budget and a capital budget. The operating budget funds ongoing outlays such as employee salaries, payment for services, interest on long-term debt, and the capital budget is used to fund major infrastructure projects such as like roads, bridges, waterworks, and they will issue long-term debt such as bonds. As you start to think about the timeline for a budget, we are really entering kind of the main time for budgeting at local governments. The typical timeline: August, September budget briefings occur with policymakers in the jurisdiction. And typically in October, a draft budget is formally presented by staff to the decision-making body. And then in December, a final budget is adopted. One of the challenges right now is that reporting lags, tax collection lags a couple months. So as the jurisdictions are beginning to create their budget, it's more difficult to do so in a time of crisis because of the fluctuations that we're seeing in revenue. Danielle is going to talk about some specifics. You know, unlike the federal government, local governments can't run a deficit. They've got to balance their budget. And this is a good time right now to get engaged. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but often local jurisdictions have some sort of public input process, whether it's a budget advisory committee or budget hearings, and it's a good opportunity to get engaged. You know, we're kind of in unprecedented times. The federal relief funds have softened the blow to local jurisdictions. The CARES Act has reimbursed cities and counties for costs incurred due to COVID-19. The federal aid through the CARES Act is helping, but it likely won't be enough to fill the hole in cities and counties' budgets caused by the economic fallout. Other programs, enhanced SNAP benefits, have injected kind of fast, high bang for the buck stimulus into the economy. That money tends to be spent immediately by families that are on those programs. And so that has been very helpful in lowering the impact to local jurisdictions, as has the expanded unemployment benefits. The 600 supplemental payment did in last week. The Congress is hopefully going to come to some agreement to extend at least a portion of that $600 benefit. And, you know, I think we will be talking about the budget crisis is not going away too quickly, and we're going to see a larger fiscal hit next year, again, because these federal stimulus funds will either run out or are tailing off, and that will ultimately be when our local jurisdictions will really feel the impact of the COVID crisis. A couple other things to kind of quickly for the to lay the groundwork. TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, was a constitutional amendment adopted in 1992, and it really did two things. It requires a vote of the people within a state or local government taxing district to approve any tax increases for that district, and it limits the ability of the state or local government for revenues to grow over time. So all surplus tax revenues beyond the kind of established revenue limit have to be returned to the taxpayer following the fiscal year, unless voters have approved a measure to allow the jurisdiction to keep and spend that money. Because TABOR revenue growth limits apply to revenue regardless of whether that revenue is spent or saved, that's an important bit. it limits the ability of government to grow their emergency reserves unless they reduce their spending accordingly. And so most local governments, 51 counties, 51 of the 64 counties, and about 90% of the cities have voted to retain or spend their revenue beyond TABOR limits. That's called debrucing, and that is because that is named after Douglas Bruce, the author of TABOR. And while there are provisions, the other thing I'll mention, while there are provisions for emergency tax increases, if a supermajority of the legislature votes to pass an override in case of an emergency, the definition of emergency is fairly restrictive, and the legislature did not choose to do that, and that provision does not apply to local government. So for what we're talking about today, there were no opportunities for local governments to enact an emergency tax to respond to the pandemic. And then the other thing that's interesting is TABOR requires governments to save 3% of its annual budget, and during a declared emergency, they can spend those reserves on directly related costs to that emergency. I think only one jurisdiction has chosen to do that so far this year. And then just some quick trends. We are seeing, because sales and use taxes provide a significant portion of government income, temporary closures, reductions of restaurants closing, high unemployment have resulted in lower sales tax revenues. The drop in travel, cancel events, etc., have had a significant impact on revenue. Without that federal stimulus, you'd be seeing a lot more jurisdictions struggling to provide the types of services that they need to continue to provide even in a time of crisis, things like trash service, police, social services. Cities have in general looked at hiring freezes, some furloughs, a reduction or a slowing of capital purchases, and pulling from savings in a couple cases. There's an ongoing review now of what to do for 2021. I think we're going to talk a little bit about that here coming up in a second. And then counties generally are in pretty good shape because they rely more on property taxes. We will see, the impact of property tax reliance could come back later if assessments change next year, and the delayed impact, that lag will likely be seen even into 2021 and possibly 2022 for counties. So that is my portion of kind of lay the groundwork. Gene, I'll kick it back to you.
Thanks, Roger. Obviously, a great overview of both the basics of local government and also what's starting to transpire across our states. Before we take our first audience question, and another quick reminder to please get those questions into the chat box. Roger, I have one of my own. So in addition to TABOR, can you talk a little bit about what the Gallagher Amendment is and how it relates to recovery?
Sure. Let's see. In 1982, the Gallagher Amendment passed as a constitutional amendment, and basically it locks residential property values to at approximately 45% of the state's total property valuation. So as property values have increased, it has pushed a higher percentage of onto commercial property versus non-residential. So non-residential property versus residential. So the taxable value of a house is dramatically reduced. Basically, it went from 30% when TABOR was, or when Gallagher, before Gallagher was passed, to now about 7%. And so that really hits local governments, which rely on that tax base of their residential tax base, fire, schools, things like that. Coloradans pay about a fourth as much as they used to pay in property taxes on their homes due to the Gallagher Amendment. So that has continued to force the state to backfill for like K through 12 and that shifting of funding from local governments to state governments have, as we all know, have really created a pinch. So you've got the combination of a lowering, a ratcheting down from Gallagher, and the inability to raise taxes without a vote of the people. And we are still relatively conservative regarding tax elections. So you've got the lowering of revenue from Gallagher and the inability to increase revenue from TABOR. And that is, the two combined is really creating a lot of problems.
Great, thank you, Roger. So we have an audience question about when you say that there is going to be a larger hit next year, are you referring to the budget talks that are starting locally for the next fiscal year, 21-22?
Yeah, I think when you talk to professionals, the budgeting folks at cities and counties, they have seen a slight reduction in revenues in some areas, but because of federal stimulus money, they've been able to backfill for the services that they're providing related to COVID. And some of those stimulus money that have gone directly to residents, whether it's the additional unemployment revenue or some of the other benefits that have been increased, they're not seeing as big of a reduction in revenues at the start of the pandemic, but and there's that 2-month lag. So what we're going to see, what is the spending happening now in July, we may not know until September. And so all the stimulus money has eased the burden this year, but they are concerned about 21 and potentially 22 at the county level because of property tax reductions. So it's really that lag, and it makes it difficult for jurisdictions to plan ahead for budgeting purposes, because the revenue projections are unstable and the revenue projections are delayed, and so that makes it more difficult to make decisions budget-wise.
Thank you again. One last question in this section of Q&A. Are you able to talk about community service block grants and other direct funding from the federal government? That is usually how some local governments fund programs, especially in the health and human services areas. And then beyond that, is there anything that organizations across the state should keep in mind with how they approach local governments in wanting to partner with them for some of those programs and activities that require some of those federal funds?
Unfortunately, I don't have, Danielle may have some information, but I don't have anything on the specific block grants from the federal government. I wish I did. I will tell you that, and again, one example, we've talked to a lot of counties, and counties have seen increased revenue increased grant funds coming from the government, from the federal government in certain areas that have, again, made it easier for them to respond. But I don't know about the different rules. I wish I had some information on that. I think as far as, communicating with your local leaders, at cities and counties during the budgeting process, this is the time to do it. And they're going to be making hard decisions about how to prioritize the revenues that they've got coming in. So yes, this is the time to engage. And the thought about value add to the local efforts. We also will talk a little bit later about some of the ways nonprofits and community organizations really are adding value and filling gaps that are out there during this crisis.
Great, thank you so much, Roger. So this was our first break that we'll take for questions this morning, with a couple more planned as well. If you would like to ask any of our panelists something during the course of this webinar, please share that question in the chat box and we'll try to get to them during the other segments of Q&A. So let's move over to Danielle. Danielle Glover serves as an account executive at CRL Associates, where she helps clients along the Front Range successfully navigate the public policy making process. Danielle has over a dozen years of experience working in legislative and regulatory affairs at the state and local level, including analyzing legislation and pursuing a robust policy agenda across all 50 states. She was named to Denverite's Who's Next in Politics list in 2018. Danielle, take it over.
Thank you, Jean. I do want to just go back to that first question that was just asked regarding the block grants, and I do want to just flag one thing with that, and that is that there is some concern coming from HUD and others when you are looking at the CARES funding and the duplication that would come from some of those block grants. So as Roger said, it is something to be aware of, and you should be reaching out as quickly as possible to the folks that you normally work with at your local jurisdiction city to talk a little bit about that. But there is definitely some concern that is happening because of the CARES Act funding around it and the duplication issue. All right, well now jumping in, I think Roger gave a really good overview of sort of what's happening big picture, and I wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive into what's happening in specific cities. So I think I pulled some cities from across the state, and you can see here that most of them are really anticipating a pretty large shortfall. One of the things that's been really difficult, as Roger alluded to, is cities being able to properly project what's happening. These numbers have changed from what they were predicting in April and even into May, where they thought that there would be a little bit of a quicker recovery. And now that we've seen that this pandemic just keeps going and is anticipated to go even longer, that's why you will sometimes see these pretty large numbers or pretty large ranges of shortfalls. So again, most of these that I've got listed here are looking at, you know, anywhere from 10 to $25 million that they're expecting as a shortfall. What you're seeing is cities looking to just reevaluate what their budget is. Almost every time that the staff is giving a presentation to the legislative body, you are seeing a little bit different numbers because there's a lot of variables, not only with just trying to predict how long this is going to last and what the impact is going to be from spending, but you have folks that are losing their unemployment benefits or their extra dollars that they're receiving now. That again is going to be something that could impact sales tax, as we've sort of seen an uptick across the state where people have been going back out, eating at restaurants, going and buying you know, things that they might need as far as household goods, etc. Whereas, you know, previously we were in a shelter in place and people were not making as many purchases. One of the things that I think is also interesting here is in Fort Collins. I just want to call that out. You are seeing that typically Fort Collins is a city that does a budget for 2 years. And this time they're only looking at 2021 because they don't know what the funding is going to look like and the revenue sources are going to look like as we move into 2021 and 2022. Additionally, you can see that most of these cities, when they were looking at addressing the shortfall for both this year and then for next year, is they started with making some furloughs. They looked at ways that they could cut funds. I mean, the cities don't necessarily want to cut funding to the services that are most needed right now, but they do have to cut somewhere. So you'll see that there's some furloughs that have been enacted by major cities, whether it was just seasonal or part-time, or whether it's been across all city employees. A couple of other examples here. You can see that in Colorado Springs, the mayor had asked for city departments to cut $20 million. They're trying to look at that from an operational view versus personnel. Folks are looking at delaying those capital improvement projects, which can include maintenance on city buildings. And this is something that cities have to look at as well when you start to forego things like maintenance right now and you save dollars here. In the future, it could be more expensive. And that is a concern that folks are weighing because they don't know how long this is necessarily going to last. Then you have other folks that it's really other cities where they're looking at where they can cut, and there's some pretty clear areas. Travel is pretty restricted right now. Folks aren't really doing a lot of trainings. And so here's an example with Telluride, who took $25,000 of their travel and training expenditures, and they're moving it over into their housing relief fund that's been established to help locals with rent and mortgage needs in both the deed restricted and the free market properties. And then we have Denver, and obviously Denver being the largest city here, it's a pretty large budget gap. We're looking at over $200 million. We've seen sales tax as of June was down almost 17%. They have lodgers tax that has greatly decreased, the occupational privilege tax, and parking revenues. For a while, Denver wasn't charging for or enforcing some of the parking at meters, et cetera. Here, both for 2020 and 2021, employees are going to be asked to take 8 furlough days. Denver has also asked all city agencies to find a way to cut at least 7.5% in this year, 2020's budget, and that is going to be moving forward at an even higher amount into the 2021 budget. For comparison, I think this is a really good point to highlight, is in 2008, the general fund dipped 6.4%, and now here, we're currently seeing at least a 10.5% loss in revenue because of COVID. So a pretty big difference between our last recession and where we are right now. Again, some of those examples that Roger listed at Denver is one of them that has cut library hours, rec center hours, and they're mowing parks less. They're reducing the trash pickup in those parks, as well as even at residential homes as well. Now, when we move to the counties, there's a few different ways that counties are addressing this. So Jefferson County is one of the counties that has not de-bruised, which is something that Roger talked a little bit about. So they have already were facing a budget crisis. They cut almost $16 million from their budget last year. And this year, they're going to have to make $12 million in cuts. One of the things that they've done is move to a 4-day work week, and we're seeing that in other counties like Adams as well. So in addition to the cuts that they've already made, they're also looking at having to cut another $6 million or so from their budget moving into 2021. Employees, we're seeing more and more counties and cities look at not providing raises to city employees. Jefferson County is one that is actually looking at not providing raises, but maybe providing a one-time payment of $500 or $1,000. But again, that's going to be in late 2021. And what you see is all of these, a lot of the commitments that we're seeing coming forward is towards the latter part of 2021 to allow the cities and counties to have the opportunity to find funds to either make up for or to better be able to predict what's happening with their budgets. Another one I really want to highlight that's listed as an example here is Morgan County. So back in March, the food stamp numbers that they had for the county were actually down from March of 2019. But by May of this year, the numbers were almost double what they were last year in May. And as Roger mentioned in his trends, the county is currently doing okay because of the federal funding, but with more and more people needing to access food stamps and other services, and then with a limited amount of federal funds that might be coming forward moving into 2021, they are becoming a little bit worried about what this continues to look like. And then what we're seeing in some of the more rural areas like Alamosa here is that while sales and property tax have actually been pretty steady, and again, I think that's attributed to the stimulus and unemployment benefits, and there's also a 2-month lag here. It is concerning because the highway use funds are down 40,000. Those funds only, funds are only a 1-month lag. And so what that indicates is that people are not traveling as much and people are not working as much. So once we see the stimulus and unemployment benefits in, there's likely to be a sharp decrease in revenue. So I think this is interesting with Alamosa and at Grand Junction, a couple of slides prior. Sometimes on the southern and the western part of Colorado, we often see the effects happening a few months later than we see on the Front Range or even a year later. One other piece I want to highlight here is when you have a significant or outsized employer, it greatly impacts what's happening in that county or in those cities. So oil and gas, especially when you think about like Weld and Adams County, those values are down 30% and people have had, there's been large layoffs by oil and gas companies in those areas. And that really impacts, especially Weld County, not just from the jobs perspective, but hospitality. A lot of the hotels that are used in the area are from oil and gas employees or adjacent industries, utilizing those. So that's down. Again, you'll see what Weld County is expecting is a 25% cut in their budget in 2021 and probably going into 2022. And this, I think, is important to look at because oil and gas also is a huge charitable giver in that area. And so there is really, there's a lot of concern coming from nonprofits about the sustainability since they receive such a large portion of their funds from the oil and gas industry. The other one I do think is unfortunate to highlight here is with agriculture. So across the state, we've seen jobs sort of dry up and there's also a drought. So you have, as Bruce here from CSU states, this is a 1-2 punch. You've got already struggling industry because of the drought, and then we have folks that are having to sell off part of their their livestock or their crops which is their main source of income, to try to make it through this year. I want to go back and just reiterate sort of how cities have been looking at this and counties have been looking at budget cuts. So I think one of the questions we often get is like, well, where are cities looking at cutting, as the area that I get funding, is it going to be cut? So for this year, because this happened, without obviously a lot of notice, jurisdictions really did, or most jurisdictions just said across the board, everybody needs to cut X amount of dollars or X percentage. And then they moved to hiring freezes, and then they moved into furlough days. So what we're looking at moving forward is that departments are going to be asked in 2021 to further cut budgets. That's really going to vary. Every jurisdiction is handling this differently. Sometimes they're looking at saying, each department needs to cut a certain percentage. Others are asking everybody to cut it the same. So really looking to individual departments to decide what is important. I will say that services are usually last on the list when it comes to budget cuts. As cities are looking at ways to offset this and help the businesses and people in their jurisdictions, we're looking at tax deferrals. They have tried to waive fees. Some cities or counties that own properties are waiving rent for a certain amount of time. And then most places are implementing some type of economic task force to look at what they can do in the future. So I would encourage everybody on this webinar to look into what your local jurisdiction is doing and see if there is any way to either get involved or review some of the updates and materials that they are providing from those task forces. So that was a lot of information, but like what's happening next? So Roger alluded to this earlier. There is talk about another federal relief package. That would be really helpful if we were able to get something worked out. Some of the things that are being considered are, money for local governments and funding for schools. There's local efforts around nonprofit, emergency relief funds. I will just highlight Denver's. If you are located in Denver, I saw there was a large chunk of folks on this webinar today. That second round of funding is open until August 7th, so check that out. And then all of this, I think the main takeaway you can hear is that there's a lot of uncertainty here, and we have ballot measures that could really impact the future as well. There's a list here that I think are important that could impact folks statewide. And then there's actually a local ballot measure tracker that the Colorado Health Foundation is going to be launching. And I will show you what that looks like so you can see what's happening in your own city.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle. Let's actually look ahead in a very specific way about that. So the elections that are happening across our state at the municipal and county levels of government, this is obviously going to be a very important election year, and the decisions that we make at the local level will significantly impact not just the services we rely on, but the policies we can advance and the quality of life that we cherish. And we've obviously seen a huge increase in the policies that impact our ability to achieve health equity at the local level as well. The nature of the way in which ballot measures are happening this year, though, has obviously changed, and there are a lot of challenges, from asking for a voter-approved tax measure in a recession, or obviously collecting signatures when the recommendation is to social distance. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit with us about the big picture trends happening across the state when it comes to the November 3rd election.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there, right? This has been a totally different world to campaign in and to collect signatures in. So we've seen some statewide ballot initiatives that haven't even been able to get on the ballot because they are, we're in COVID and are unable to collect enough signatures. I think it's going to be interesting to see what's going to happen in the future. You have a lot of ballot measures that were being considered pre-COVID, especially around taxes. And now that you have, now that we are in a budget crisis where cities may not be able to provide as many services, we've seen cuts in state funding in some areas like mental health. And then at the same time, we want to go to voters and ask them to pay a little bit more for products and services. I think that it's going to be interesting to see how that all shakes out, because again, most of these ideas were coming forward back when the economy was really healthy, and it felt like people would be willing to consider some of those tax measures.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danielle. I have a couple of audience questions that I wanted to ask of you at this point in time. So the first is, in what ways are local budget constraints factoring into other areas or programs? So for example, a lot of new behavioral health initiatives like the Caring for Denver Foundation being one of them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're in uncharted waters here. Caring for Denver, for example, is a newer program. They haven't been able to, they've never really worked in a recession. So that's a great example of a program that is funded by sales tax revenue. And as I just shared, there was a huge decrease in sales tax. So at the same time that Caring for Denver is going to be receiving less funds, a lot of the areas that they typically fund are actually seeing cuts and are going to need additional money, right? So where they typically give, there's going to be a greater need. And so it's going to be a situation where Caring for Denver is going to have to figure out how they prioritize in giving to those areas with those reduced funds.
Great, thank you. The next question is about small business. Do you know about the impact on small businesses being studied at the local level? And are there strategies to address their plight being considered by policymakers?
Absolutely. I think that one of the areas where we've seen cities step up is trying to get grants out to small businesses. I mentioned earlier that there are several economic development councils or task force that are being put together at the local level to explore ways to help those small businesses. So you have one, Denver was giving funds away early on. Adams County actually has an interesting program right now where they're giving some funds to small businesses and to nonprofits. I believe it's on a first come, first serve basis, where they're giving grants to allow businesses to implement measures that allow for better social distancing. So I think that there's a lot of ways that cities are looking at it, deferring rent, deferring tax revenue. Everybody's taking a little bit different approach, but I would encourage you to look at your city's local economic task force that they put together to see what's happening specifically there.
Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us, Danielle. One more quick reminder to our audience that we'll have another chance to ask your questions during this webinar, so please continue to chat those into the Zoom chat box. I'm going to transition over to our last speaker this morning. Our last speaker is Alvina Vasquez. Alvina is founder and president of PowerMap, a community outreach and communications firm working with foundations and advocacy organizations across the state. Alvina served as political director for Jared Polis's campaign for governor, and she was recognized as one of Denver's 40 under 40 and serves on boards of organizations focused on education, equality, and civic engagement. Alvina, it is interesting to hear what nonprofits and foundations are doing locally. In a couple of minutes, we would like to hear from some of our members of the audience about this, but what is happening in your community and in your organization in response to the crisis along with the public sector? Do you, Alvina, have some specific examples that you can share?
So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about gaps in funding. These are things that most of the folks on the phone know about, but I'm hoping that we can generate a little bit of a chatter on what's happening in your local areas. So that's what we're going to talk about. I think we all know about the funding that is happening, the funding gaps that are happening in basic human needs. We heard Roger talk about DOLA and federal money coming in, and the local initiatives, but it's still not enough money. And as we talked about, there's going to be a lag, so we don't even know how much the gap is going to be. But the trends are that the basic human needs that are of the utmost importance and what they're seeing requests from. And those experiencing those needs are the same groups of people that were experiencing economic challenges before COVID hit. So COVID has exacerbated those problems for those communities that are immigrant refugee communities and other minority communities, but it also exacerbated for you, the nonprofits that continue to try to serve these groups because the need is so much bigger. Not only that, but we have folks that were not on the front lines before that are now on the front lines because they're working in grocery stores or they're trying to keep the food supply open. So what's happening is individuals who didn't have access to healthcare or sick leave or those things that could make their lives a little bit better before COVID, now it's like even worse. So Colorado started the Help Fund, right? And I think a lot of you applied for those. And it was a cycle of five grant cycles. And these were people that the direct service organizations and nonprofit agencies in smaller communities only have access to the Help Colorado Fund because they didn't actually like they didn't actually fill the requirements for federal aid funding or CARES money. So the Help Colorado Now Fund raised $17 million that was distributed over 5 cycles, and then the last one ended May 30th. And the grants ranged from like $2,500 to $25,000, and it covered like lots of different issues: education, healthcare, mental health, PPE, especially for those with, sorry, I lost my video, but grants ranging from $2,500 to $25,000. And if you go online, you can actually see all the awardees that have been listed. But the takeaway is that the larger communities with the larger population centers are getting most of the money. So those folks in smaller communities are going to
Alvina, we may have lost you. I will try and step in with some of the resources that you have listed on the slide. While I'm doing that, you may just want to try and call back in with just your phone. We can leave your video off for the time being. One of the ways in which we wanted to discuss some of the ways for our audience to engage are a lot of these resources that you see right now. Even though today's discussion was heavily focused on cities, towns, and counties, there are rather obviously a number of ways in which the universe of local governments has really not just grown, but been active during this crisis. And you can see what is listed here are not just some of the ways in which the state through the Department of Local Affairs or through CDPHE have been assisting not just the local governments, but a lot of the on-the-ground advocates and nonprofits within communities, but also some of the ways in which the associations and those sorts of statewide advocacy groups are also assisting with the recovery efforts. Alvina, let me see if you are by chance back on. Can you hear us?
I can hear you guys. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, do you want to pick it back up?
Sure. So like Jean was saying, there are tons of resources out there. DOLA, who is the state agency that is there to create recovery and resiliency for communities, is going to continue to help out as much as they can. But I think what's important is that the smaller cities, you guys know this, you're going to have to be advocating even harder and have more challenges, because a lot of the dollars are going to go into the major population centers.
Alvina, thank you. I'm going to get into some of the questions that we are receiving from our audience. Are you still there, Alvina? Okay, well, Roger and Danielle, if you are still available to take some questions, I will pose these questions of you. The first is about some of the rural communities in our state, and either one of you are free to jump in here. What are some of the resources that are going to be targeted to rural communities specifically to help balance some of the unequal funding that might be occurring across our state?
So I'll try to jump in here. Sorry about that. I'm sure Alvina can definitely address this a little bit better, but I think What you've seen is the state is working really hard to help especially the high country, and I'll talk about I'm thinking of the Pitkins, the Eagle counties, Summit counties, Route counties, to try to get economies up and running there. So really concentrating on how do we deliver, or how do we provide variances, or how do we provide opportunities for those counties and those cities to be able to get up and running again, just to reinvigorate their sales tax base and their typical tax base to be able to provide what they've been doing previously. So one, I think they're looking at it from an economic development perspective and trying to help the counties and cities help themselves. Additionally, there is a a statewide effort to look at what we can be doing as far as grants and getting those out to areas that maybe don't have as many nonprofits or larger nonprofits that can fund others in those rural areas. I see that we have Alvina back, so she might be able to address that question a little bit better than I can, but I think that the takeaway is that there's a recognition that maybe things haven't been equitably distributed, and there is efforts ongoing to change that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That coming out of this meeting, I hope you guys see the resources of what's happening, but also know that their challenges remain, and we just have to keep advocating and doing more for our communities, because there's not enough, and there's even more people now that are on the front lines experiencing economic loss in their homes.
So speaking of advocacy, can you talk a little bit about the ins and outs of what would be best for all of the community advocates across the state to really effectively use their voice at the local level? So things like the process by which they should be considering their advocacy with local leaders, or some of the more important timelines that happen across local governments. What are some of the considerations that our audience should be considering? And I'll pose that as the last question before we wrap up today's discussion.
I'll try to start off, and then Danielle or Alvina may have something to add on. But as we talked about, this is kind of the prime budget season for local jurisdictions between now and the end of the year, and really now through October, maybe into November, and then budgets are kind of finalized and sent for final adoption. So I think talking to your council members, your commissioners, budget directors about important programs to your agencies, and then also, and I would really talk about how your agencies are partnering or backfilling or having a value add. One of our chat comments earlier talked about the value add that nonprofits provide, and make a case that that value add is allowing local jurisdictions, local municipalities, counties to provide more with less resources. So I think showing how you're working together with their funds, and how those funds that they need to allocate in their budget really are multiplied by the efforts of your organizations. That's a way I would start that conversation.
If I could just add one other piece of advice I have is, when you do go and meet with, whether it's the folks that you normally work with at a city agency or county agency, or it is with one of the elected officials, I think coming with statistics is super important, and maybe even more important than in previous times, including being able to talk about what happens if you lose your funding, what that would actually mean for your organization and for the people that you serve, and building up that narrative so that people can understand what is going to be happening. Because unfortunately, as we face this budget crisis, hard decisions are going to have to be made. And I think it's easier for folks to understand the consequences of the hard votes and the hard budget decisions that they're going to have to make if they have really good statistics and a better understanding of the impacts that budget cuts will have to your programming.
Thank you, everyone. And a special thank you to our audience for sticking with us through some slight technical difficulties this morning. At this time, I'd really like to extend a sincere thank you to Roger Sherman, Danielle Glover, and Alvina Vasquez for joining us this morning. They make up the Colorado Health Foundation's new consulting team with a local policy focus, and you'll be hearing from them a lot more into the future. A recording of today's webinar, the presentation slides, and the links shared in the chat box will all be sent out to you later today, so please be on the lookout for those resources. We are so glad that you have joined us for today's discussion, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. All the best.